Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Human Stories, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. I'm Margaret Quinn, but everyone here calls me Maggie. I'm 71, a widow, and the keeper of a cedar-sided house that faces the Pacific. On windy days, the front door swells and sticks. On quiet mornings, salt dries on the glass like frost. I once pictured this place, Seabrook House, as where my daughter would bring her kids for long weekends, where we'd rinse sand from small feet in the mudroom sink. I kept that picture for years. The Tuesday it shattered smelled like rain. I spent the morning pressing the edges of a patchwork quilt I've been making, each square cut from Lila's old clothes: the purple field day t-shirt, the chambray dress with the missing button, the camp sweatshirt with threadbare cuffs. At 2:07 p.m., when Lila usually clocks out from the clinic, I called. A man answered on the second ring. "Brandon Cole," he said, smooth as a business card. "Hi, Brandon. It's Maggie. I'm trying to get my dates straight." I kept my voice even. "When's the wedding?" Paper rustled, or the performance of it. "We're keeping it really tight, Maggie. Immediate circle only. Makes the day simpler." The words were clean and stainless. They slid in without noise and cut anyway. "I see," I said. "You know how these things get," he added, turning companionable. "We'll swing by Seabrook after the honeymoon to pick up a few boxes. Lila still has keys, right?"
"Seabrook is accounted for," I said. "Have a good afternoon."
I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. My wrist trembled the way it does when coffee meets bad news. I stood, breathed, and went looking for a small task to pin myself to. At the mailbox, the carrier had left catalogs and a cream envelope with gold edging that wasn't mine. I walked it to the bungalow 2 doors down and handed it to a red-haired woman watering rosemary. "Wrong house," I said. "Story of my week," she answered, then studied my face. "You doing okay?" "Just a long day." The lie sat easier than explaining how a person can be both mother and outsider at once. By evening, my neighbor Carrie texted me a link with no caption, just a blue heart. I tapped it. Photos opened like windows: Lila in ivory silk beneath a wreath of eucalyptus, Brandon in a tux that fit like he'd been born inside it, his parents framed by sun that made them look like they owned the afternoon. I scrolled: group shot, cake, first dance with her chin tucked against his shoulder. I searched the edges for a sleeve, a silver head, the corner of a familiar smile, and found only other people's joy. I closed the curtains, but dusk still found a way in the kind of light that makes every surface honest. I spread the quilt across the table. It smelled like cedar and laundry soap. With my thumb, I traced the seam where 2 pieces met her camp sweatshirt stitched to the field day shirt, and thought how many small cuts it takes to make one strong square. Seabrook House sat around me like a thing with breath. My husband Dan used to rub linseed oil into the stair rail every fall until it gleamed like river water. After he died, I learned the angle of my wrist to do it myself. We never had yacht club money. We had an accountant's patience and a union pension steadiness paid forward into timber and nails, and a view steady enough to quiet bad days. I believed I was building a place my daughter could launch from and return to. I believed that counted. Near 8, the house settled. Pipes ticked. The heater sighed. I boiled water for tea, and by habit counted the brass keys in the dish by the stove: 2 old mortise, 1 for the garage, 1 new deadbolt after a rash of winter break-ins. I turned each tag forward. If there's a religion left to me, it's in small alignments: corners, mitered, flush, checkbook, balanced hinges that don't squeal. The phone rang again. I let it ring twice. "Hey, Maggie," Brandon said, voice shiny with friendliness. "Quick thing. We're out by your place and can't get the front door to budge. Looks like the key's off. Figured I'd save you a trip and grab a couple boxes Lila left." Wind fretted at the line. I pictured him on the porch under the copper light Dan installed, jiggling metal that didn't belong to him. "That door sticks when the weather swings," I said, which was true as far as it went. "You don't have my permission to enter." A pause, then that laugh he keeps for people he believes are in his way. "It's family, Maggie." "I keep track of my family," I said, "and my locks." Another pause. A car door thumped behind him. "Okay then, we'll catch you later." "Call ahead," I said, and hung up. I washed my cup and set it upside down to dry. In the window, I caught the outline of my shoulders narrower than I remember, and the bright quilt on the table behind me. I folded the quilt back into itself, square into square, until it was a careful bundle I could lift, and set it on the chair nearest the door. The house listened. The ocean kept doing its old work, arriving, withdrawing, arriving again. I turned the deadbolt and felt the weight travel from my hand into the wood. The keys settled in the dish with a sound like coins counted true, exactly enough, not a penny more. The next morning, the house woke before I did. A gull struck the gutter with its feet and slid laughing at its own stunt. Somewhere along the block, a screen door banged twice like a punctuation mark. I made coffee, smoothed the quilt's edges with my palm, and set the keys in my coat pocket where their shape could remind me what still belonged to me. The bank sat 3 blocks off the harbor, a brick building with a brass clock that always ran 2 minutes fast. Inside it smelled like polished wood and the paper dust of old ledgers. Mr. Patel stepped out from his glass office when he saw me, sleeves rolled a tie the color of blueberries. He had handled our mortgage when Dan was alive and knew the slow arithmetic of our lives. "Maggie," he said, "come back where it's quiet." In his office, the blinds made narrow ladders of light across the carpet. I placed my wallet on the desk and said I need to revoke every power of attorney tied to my name and accounts. I want in-person verification for withdrawals above $100, no exceptions. He didn't ask why. He nodded the way doctors nod when a patient has done the hard thinking at home. "We can do that," he said, and printed the forms. He read each page aloud, not because I needed him to, but because respect sometimes looks like not skipping the boring parts. Pen in hand, I signed slowly the way Dan did when he added his name to something he planned to keep. The nib left grooves that caught the light. "Anything else?" Mr. Patel asked. "Fraud alerts," I said. "On the credit cards. And if someone calls quoting my birth date, I'd like you to pretend you've never heard of me." He smiled. "Consider it done." Then softer. "You're not the first mother to need a tighter fence. You won't be the last." Back on the sidewalk, the wind had turned from salt to rain. I crossed to a second-floor office above a bakery where a brass plaque read Ava Sinclair, Elder Law. The waiting room had 2 blue chairs of fern and a sound machine that tried to be a waterfall. On the wall, certificates from the state bar and a snapshot of a golden retriever with a stick too big for its own ambition. Ava met me with a handshake that said she was on time, even if the world wasn't. Silver at her temples, sensible shoes, a pen that clicked only when she meant it. "Tell me what happened," she said, and I did, from the phone call to the photos to the key that couldn't find the lock it wanted. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she slid a small notebook across the desk. "Start a log," she said. "Date, time, names, exact words when you can. If they show up, write down what they wear and whether they smell like rain or cologne. Juries believe details because details are what truth looks like." She wasn't theatrical about it. She was practical in a way that settled the air. Also, she added, "Get eyes on the property. Doorbell camera at minimum. Inside, something to watch the entryway and hall. Not to spy, but to remember. Your memory is good. Video is better." "I can manage that. One more thing," she said. "Don't sign anything. If someone uses the phrase for your own good, assume they're about to make your life worse." When I left her office, I had the notebook, a card with her direct number, and a feeling like the first tight loop of a knot that would hold. By noon, a van with a magnetic logo, Ortiz Protective Systems, pulled into my drive. The man who stepped out wore a beanie and carried 2 tool cases. "Deshawn," he said, offering a hand the size of a mitt. "Your lawyer's good people. Let's walk." We moved through the house as if it were a map of the ways it could be honest. He bent to study the gap under the front door, tapped the jamb where the wood had swelled, and measured the sightline from the stairs to the kitchen. "You've got great angles," he said. "Lots of light. That's a gift and a liability." He set a smart doorbell under the copper porch light. Dan had wired its ring a soft white halo. A small dome camera went high on the hall where the stairs curved like a question mark. Another faced the mudroom door that opened to the side yard. He mounted a discreet button near the entry. "Silent call to dispatch," he said, "and a tone for you so you know it took." On my kitchen table, he set a thin monitor, showed me the feed's porch hall side door, each labeled with the time in clean digital numbers. "Won't stop a determined idiot," he said, coiling a cable with the grace of someone who respects order, "but it makes a record. Records win arguments." I brewed tea and handed him a mug. "What do you drink?" I asked. "Whatever's hot," he said, grinning. Then his face shifted. "You okay if they come back?" "I have locks," I said, "and I know exactly where the button is." He nodded, packed his tools, and left a yard sign at the gate, not for advertising, but as a line in the sand, property monitored. Afternoon cooled to evening. The quilt lay across the back of the couch, its colors deeper in the gray light squares of childhood worn into something tougher. I had written my first entries in Ava's notebook in block letters that refused to wobble. 12:50 p.m. Bank. Revoked POA. Patel confirmed. 2:10 p.m. Ava Sinclair log cameras, no signatures. 3:35 to 4:20 p.m. Ortiz installed doorbell plus 2 interior cams, silent button at entry. At 5:30, the doorbell showed me a live oval of my own porch rain, freckling the lens, the halo a soft coin. I watched the ocean blanch and darken the way an old bruise does. The kettle clicked off. Then 3 shadows crossed the frame. Brandon stood closest to the door in a coat that didn't care about the weather. Behind him, a man in a camel overcoat held a leather portfolio against his ribs, the way people hold good news. Lila hovered to the side, her hands knit, like she was trying to keep them from saying something all by themselves. I opened the door to the chain. "Evening," Brandon said, smile bright with borrowed sunshine. We were in the neighborhood. The man in the camel coat leaned to sightline with the chain. "Miss Quinn, Paul Denby," he said, extending a card that kissed the crack and fell to the mat when I didn't take it. "We represent Brandon and Lila in some routine matters. Thought we could take 5 minutes to tidy up a few signatures." "Pure housekeeping." "Housekeeping is a broom and a dustpan," I said. "Whatever you're carrying is something else." "It reduces administrative burden," Denby said smoothly. "Power of attorney simple limited. Gives your family flexibility." "My family is flexible," I said. "My authority is not." He didn't love that. Brandon's mouth tightened. Lila looked at her shoes. "Maggie," Brandon said, switching to the voice you use on a neighbor who refuses to move their trash cans. "Nobody's trying to steamroll you. This is how adults manage big properties. Liability taxes, all that junk. Lila's worried about you up here alone. We all are." He thought the word "we" would feel warm. It didn't. "I'm not signing anything on my porch in the rain," I said. "If you have documents, send them to my counsel." Denby blinked. "You have counsel?" "I do," I said, and let the chain speak for me when it clinked against the plate. He slid a single page against the gap anyway, the edge dampening as the rain wicked in. "Just initial here to acknowledge receipt," he said. "No commitment, purely procedural." "Leave it on the mat," I said. "I'll pick it up with tongs." Brandon laughed too loud. "Come on, Maggie." Lila lifted her eyes, then brief and bright with something that could have been apology. The porch light picked out the gold of her earring. We looked at each other like people at opposite ends of a dock watching the same tide try 2 different tricks. Denby tucked the page back into his portfolio. "Expect a formal petition," he said, polite as a thorn. I closed the door. The chain thudded against the wood. Through the thin line of sight the door granted me, I watched them step backward into the rain. Brandon first, Lila last. The camera caught their faces and fixed them to the corner of the screen, with a date and time none of us could argue with later. At 9, the storm came hard enough to make the porch light buzz. I set the quilt over my knees in the front room and watched the doorbell feed without meaning to. The white circle pulsed with each drop. A car eased along the curb and idled. The driver killed the headlights, but not the engine. After a minute, someone in a hood moved toward the steps and tried a key in the lock once, twice, as if practice had ever made a wrong key fit. I placed my thumb on the small button near the door. The tone in the wall answered short and certain, like a promise that didn't require anyone else to believe it. The camera's red dot held steady. The ocean went on with its counting. The lock did its job. The siren reached me before the storm did a thin silver sound running the length of the block. On the doorbell feed, the hooded figure tried the key. A third time, stood still long enough to be counted, then slipped back toward the idling car. Blue light fanned over the wet hedges. When the knock came, I opened to 2 officers and the smell of rain off their jackets. "Evening, ma'am," the taller one said. "Officer Delaney, this is Officer Cho. You placed a panic call." I led them to the monitor on the kitchen table. The porch lens showed the last 60 seconds, as if they'd been laid in a museum case, the hand at my lock, the decision to retreat, the gloved fingers on the rail. I pressed play again, then again. Delaney whistled softly through his teeth. "You know him?" he asked. "I know who thinks he belongs here." Cho took a report with a steadiness that made room for my breath to catch and find itself. He asked for names, dates, the model of my deadbolt, the pattern on the hooded jacket. I gave him what I had, including the pages I'd written in Ava's notebook that afternoon. He didn't roll his eyes at my block letters or the underlines. He stapled a small card to the top of the report and pushed it toward me. "Temporary protective order is the cleanest next step," he said. "Night judge will sign if your lawyer files first thing. If they come back, call us, don't open the door. I know how to keep a door closed." Delaney nodded as if I'd said something useful. "Nice system," he added, tipping his chin at the cameras. "Video remembers what nerves forget." When they left, the porch looked colder for a moment, then only wet. I set a copy of the report in the top drawer of the secretary where Dan used to keep the tax folders and locked the drawer out of habit more than need. The house exhaled. I slept in the chair by the window with the quilt over my knees and my shoes on. Morning blew the storm inland. I called Ava before coffee, and she answered on the first ring voice, fully awake. By 10, we were in a hallway that smelled like floor wax and old paper, waiting outside a courtroom door with a brass number that changed nothing and meant everything. Ava spoke to a clerk who had seen too many mornings like mine. 20 minutes later, the judge signed with a pen the size of a small tool and handed the papers back without commentary. The blue stamp sparkled while it dried. On the way home, Ava slid an extra copy into a transparent sleeve. "One for the door frame," she said. "One for your bag. One for a drawer they'll never open." At Seabrook, I taped the order in the narrow strip of wall just inside the entry eye level, the way people hang family photos. It looked both out of place and exactly correct. Around 3, there was a knock that sounded like practice. Through the doorbell lens, I saw a woman with a messenger bag and a chin-length bob losing a small argument with the wind. She held up a badge that caught what light there was. "Miss Quinn," she called, voice clear. "I'm Dinah Reeves with Adult Protective Services. I received a report and need to conduct a brief well-being check. May we talk?" The phrase "received a report" sat between us like a damp umbrella. I opened the door, left the chain on, took the measure of her face, and unhooked the chain. "Come in, Miss Reeves." She stepped inside slow as someone walking into a church that isn't theirs. The house made its old sounds. She took in the quilt on the couch, the tidy bowl of keys, the paper sleeve of the protective order on the wall. "I appreciate your time," she said. "I'll be direct. The report mentioned memory concerns, trouble managing the home, possible confusion around finances." "Who reported it?" I asked. "I can't say," she answered, not unkindly. I gestured to the kitchen table. "Let me show you how I confuse my way through Tuesdays." We sat. I laid out my check register with its straight columns, the automatic drafts circled in green ink, Mr. Patel's card, the bank form stamped yesterday. I set Ava's notebook beside it and opened to the first page, then the second, letting her see the dates and times and names I had already trained myself to repeat. I showed her the porch feed, the red dot steady in the top corner. "Orientation questions," she said, apologetic, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Today's date." I gave it. "Full address." I gave that too, including the zip code that still feels like a password every time I say it. She asked about medications, and I described each bottle's label and the way I set them in a row by dose like small, obedient soldiers. When she asked what I'd eaten today, I pointed at the pan on the stove where onion skins curled and a soup simmered slow enough to forgive inattention. "May I look around?" she asked. "Please." We walked the hall. I touched the rail Dan used to oil. She peered into the mudroom and noted the shoes lined heel to heel. She checked the smoke detector. In Lila's old room, she paused at the shelf of childhood books and smiled a little at Blueberries for Sal. Back at the door, she rested her hand on the strap of her bag and looked me in the eye. "Ms. Quinn." "Thank you," she said. "I'll file this as no cause for intervention. If anyone raises concerns again, I'll have this visit to reference." "There are days the house feels too big," I said, because it was true. "But I know which key is which. That much is obvious." She slipped her card onto the table. "If anyone insists otherwise, call me." She left a rectangle of drier air in her wake. I put her card in the drawer with the judge's order, then stood still long enough to hear the new quiet settle. At 5, the phone rang with Lila's name lit up as if someone had polished each letter. I let it ring once in my hand before answering. "Mom," she said, voice small, every syllable smoothed. "We made a mess of last night. Can we have dinner? Just to talk without the weather at the door." Where I asked. "Our place," she said. And the hesitation between the words was its own kind of punctuation. 6:30. I said yes because I wanted to hear the part of her voice that wasn't anyone else's. Their condo sat over a dry cleaner and a Pilates studio, new wood floors that hadn't learned to creak yet. The table wore its best version of welcome plates. A candle that smelled like a pear had married a flower, 2 wine glasses set at my place, though I don't drink much. The food sat prettily on platters, warm in the way ovens do without actually having been used. Brandon opened the door like a host on a brochure. "Maggie," he said, the 2 syllables polished. "Come in out of that wind." Lila's smile came a breath later, real and thin as tissue. She tugged her sweater sleeves down over the bones of her wrists. We sat. The first minutes were the easy talk that pretends to be the kind that heals. Work schedules, the weather playing tricks with the tides, a joke about the gulls learning to open trash lids. I watched the way Lila's eyes moved when she laughed. I watched the way Brandon watched me watching. It took him 8 minutes to turn his chair an inch toward business. "You'll be happier without the day-to-day of a big place," he said, cutting his steak with attention borrowed from a different conversation. "Taxes, maintenance, insurance, all that scaffolding can crush a person." "I'm not crushed," I said. "No one said you were." He sipped his wine. "We can carry some of it. That's what family does. Consolidate, streamline. You could keep your bedroom if that's the sticking point." Lila flinched the smallest amount. The candle guttered and found itself again. I set my fork down and looked at the shelf behind him where a new set of leather-bound books pretended to be read. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. "I want you to say you'll stop white-knuckling a situation that doesn't need to be hard," he said, still smiling as if for a camera. "Let us move you from complicated to simple." He had learned to dress the word take, as if it were a favor. Lila stared at her glass. When I reached for the water carafe, she reached too, and our fingers touched brief and electric. She looked up fast, as if the look itself were a question she couldn't keep off the table. In the pause that followed, a real sound entered the dryer in the shop below, thumping a zipper against the drum. Lila startled, then leaned closer, voice a thread. "My cards are a mess," she said, barely moving her lips. "I'm trying to fix it." Brandon's smile didn't change, but his hand went to her forearm like punctuation. "We're in this together," he said brightly. Dessert appeared like a magician's proof, a cake with a gloss on it that matched the plates. We ate what our manners required and stopped when politeness no longer had a job to do. I thanked them and stood. At the door, Lila hugged me fast, the kind of embrace you give when you're practicing the courage to give a better one. Brandon held the knob as if he were doing something generous. "Think on it," he said. Outside, the night had cooled into its own opinion. I walked to my car and sat with my hands on the wheel until my heart forgot its drum solo. On the passenger seat, Ava's notebook waited with its square, honest lines. I wrote in it there under the streetlight, the way people write to themselves on train platforms and in waiting rooms when they need facts to be facts. 6:41 p.m. Condo. Plate settings for 3 food plated, not cooked. There no oven heat. Candle, pear, flour. Brandon, carry some of it. Keep bedroom move from complicated to simple. Lila whispered, "Cards are a mess. Contact brief." At home, I slid the copy of the court order a fraction straighter and set the keys in their bowl. The ocean pushed and pulled against the dark, like it had always planned to not louder, not quiet, just steady. The doorbell's white halo cooled from bright to soft. I folded the quilt across the back of the chair and sat long enough to hear the house learn my breathing again. The red dot in the corner of the monitor kept its one job without complaint. By morning, the red dot on the monitor had watched an entire night without complaint. The house smelled like wet cedar and coffee. When the mail slid through the slot, it made a sound like a small door closing. I found a thick envelope inside the county seal stamped in blue. The return address was the courthouse. The petition's title ran across the top in serif letters that pretended to be calm in the matter of guardianship of Margaret Quinn. I read the words twice, then once aloud in a voice that didn't shake, as if saying them could make them only print and not a plan. The allegations were careful confusion, impaired judgment, vulnerability to financial mismanagement, exhibits to follow. I set the packet on the table and laid my palm over it, the way you steady a map when a draft wants to change your route. Ava arrived with the reins still in her hair, briefcase clipped tight. She scanned the petition page by page, pen ticking in measured beats. "All right," she said. "We answer. We don't try to shout down a document. We file our own." She turned my front room into a deliberate kind of order, copies, tabs, a legal pad with neat ladders of handwriting. She circled phrases like immediate risk and patterns consistent with decline, then drew lines from them to dates in my notebook, to the protective order, to the police report. When she looked up, her face had that expression people get when a picture finally clicks into focus. "We'll request an independent neuropsych evaluation," she said. "I'll file today. You'll likely be scheduled within a week." I nodded. Nerves are a private little animal. Mine ran the length of my arms and settled only when my fingers found the quilt and flattened one stubborn edge. The appointment came sooner than that. Dr. Miriam Harper's office sat on a corner near the hospital where ambulances turn and leave their lights on in the daytime. Books lined 2 walls. A clock ticked in a way that didn't nag. Dr. Harper had steady eyes and hands that didn't fidget. "We'll just talk and do a few tasks," she said, like we were about to bake something. "It's not a trap." She asked for the date, and I gave it. She asked who the governor was, then asked me to recall 3 words, river, nickel, lavender, and tuck them away for later. We counted backward by 7s from a number nobody picks on purpose. I drew a clock and set the hands to 10 past 11. I described how I pay the gas bill and what time the bank opens on Wednesdays in our town. She placed colored blocks on the table and asked me to match a pattern I'd seen for only a second. She asked me what I had for breakfast, and I surprised us both by admitting it had been buttered toast and the heel of last night's soup eaten with the spoon I like because it's heavier than it looks. "When you talk about your home," she said, "what do you call the things in it?" "By their jobs," I said. "The blue bowl is for keys. The small pan is for eggs. The quilt is for keeping my knees warm and my hands honest." Her smile reached her eyes for the first time. Near the end, she asked for those 3 words again. I gave them back in order, felt ridiculous pride at getting them clean. She finished with a paragraph that included my name and no evidence of cognitive impairment, and slid it across the desk for me to read. "You'll get the full report," she said. But that's the headline. On the morning of the first hearing, the courthouse steps held rain in the grooves. Inside, the air had the insistent quiet of places where decisions happen, whether or not anyone's ready for them. Brandon sat with shoulders squared and a tie that had learned confidence. Lila's hair was pulled back. She kept one hand inside her sleeve, as if her wrist were a secret. Denby stood at counsel table and smoothed papers with 2 fingers the way bartenders polish glasses. The judge entered, a tall man with careful posture who looked like he read. He called the case. Denby rose first.
Your Honor, he began, voice arranged like the lobby of an expensive hotel. This is a situation no one wants, but all responsible parties recognize. Miss Quinn has exhibited signs of confusion, nocturnal wandering conversations with herself, resistance to routine assistance. The family seeks limited guardianship to prevent foreseeable harm.
He clicked a remote. A clip filled the screen. The porch at night. The halo of the doorbell light me in the frame, speaking softly with no one else visible. The audio caught only wind and the small sounds houses make when they remember their lives. The clip ended with me turning away, the white circle fading. Ms. Quinn talking to herself after midnight. Denby said, gentle as a diagnosis, "This is not safety." Ava rose without hurry, as if the floor belonged to her for a certain number of measured breaths. Your Honor, context matters, she said. This is the defendant's home security system. We request the full segment. The judge nodded. Ava's version ran next, the same porch, the same halo, but longer. It showed me re-entering the house, the hall camera catching my hand as it reached for the small button, the tone sounding in the wall. It showed me sitting at the kitchen table, opening a notebook and writing the entry with time, weather, and the description of the car idling at the curb. The clock on the monitor and the date stamp in the corner agreed. Ava said nothing for 3 beats. This is not wandering, she said. This is documenting.
Denby objected to adjectives. The judge overruled him without amusement.
We broke at noon. In the corridor, I watched the way Brandon glanced at Lila when he thought nobody was measuring how often. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor, where a pattern of tiles repeated without trying to be art. I went home and ate half a sandwich standing at the counter. The ocean outside behaved the way seas behave in paintings, convincing, impersonal. Day 2 offered witnesses. Denby called a neighbor from around the corner, Mr. Harrow, who took the stand holding his hat like it might answer for him. Sir Denby said, "Have you observed any behaviors of concern?" "I've seen her on the porch late," Harrow said. "Talking like folks do on phones, only I didn't see a phone. Lights on at odd hours." "Did you ever speak with Miss Quinn about your concerns?" Ava asked on cross. "No, ma'am," he said. "Didn't see my place." "Did you ever see her leave the stove on?" "No." "Forget where she lived?" "No." "Then your concern is the hours she keeps." He swallowed. "Guess so." Next came a pharmacist, Ms. Kellerman, who admitted she'd signed a letter drafted by someone else, words like non-compliance and early refills printed where her certainty should have been. On cross, Ava laid the pharmacy records beside the letter like 2 hands that didn't match. Dates aligned exactly with prescriptions. The letter looked thinner in the new light. Before resting, Ava asked to play a short clip with audio captured by the doorbell mic during the porch encounter. I'd logged as 3 visitors, camel coat, damp page. The screen showed shoes and cuffs, and the letter edge darkening with rain. It recorded Brandon's voice pitched lower than his smile. "Push harder," he said. "If she signs it, the house is ours and this whole mess is over." Lila's reply was a whisper. The microphone gave it back anyway. "Don't say that here." Denby objected to relevance. The judge let the clip finish and wrote something down that didn't look like a doodle. By the 3rd day, the courtroom recognized the faces it would spend the morning with. The benches held a few strangers who'd learned our names and the rhythm of the HVAC. When the clerk called me, I stood, felt the floor under my shoes, and let my hands find each other loosely in my lap. Ava's questions were not tricks. "Ms. Quinn," she said, "can you describe your daily routine?" I told the truth in the order it happens. Coffee keys in the blue bowl. Check the mailbox. Walk to the water. If the weather asks nicely, soup on days when the wind wants a pot to mind. I described the cameras, the notebook, the bank visit, the way the door swells when it rains, and how I lean my hip against it the way Dan taught me. She held up the neuropsych report. "Did you complete an evaluation with Dr. Miriam Harper?" "I did." "And what did she conclude?" "That my mind is my own," I said plain. Denby kept his voice friendly for cross. "Miss Quinn, do you ever talk to yourself?" "I live alone," I said. "Sometimes I move my shopping list from my head to my mouth. It keeps the list from running away." "Do you often forget appointments?" "I write them down with a pen. Paper remembers." He paced a small square as if checking that the floor was still there. "Isn't it true you sometimes feel the house is too big for you?" "True," I said. "It's also true that my boots are too big for August. Both things can be true without me needing a new pair of feet." A small, low ripple moved through the benches and got itself under control when the judge looked up. Before Ava sat down, she lifted the quilt from the evidence table and brought it to me. "Miss Quinn, you've mentioned this in your notes. What is it?" "Bits of my daughter's life." I said the fabric warm where my palms had been. Camp sweatshirt, field day t-shirt. A dress with a button we never found. I started it the winter after my husband died. It's something I make with my hands when the room feels too quiet. "Why bring it today?" "So I don't forget what I've held together," I said. "It's squares anyone can recognize, the way ordinary time makes a pattern when you sew it side by side. That helps me think. That's all." Ava didn't ask me to say more. She folded the quilt twice the way I do when the day is done. Denby declined further questions.
When we finished, the judge thanked counsel with a courtesy that didn't sound automatic and asked for the exhibits he wanted brought forward. The clerk stacked them with the careful movements of someone who has learned how to keep edges square. Papers rustled. The door at the back opened to let in a draft, and a woman with a stroller who realized she'd come to the wrong place and left without anyone having to tell her.
Outside noon, light lay flat on the courthouse steps. Ava and I walked down without speaking. At the bottom, she touched my elbow, small, precise.
"You did what you came to do," she said. At home, the protective order's blue stamp looked the same as it had the day I taped it up. I pressed it flatter with 2 fingers anyway. I straightened the bowl so the keys lay shoulder to shoulder. The ocean kept its measure. I set the quilt across the back of the chair and sat long enough for the house to recognize how I breathe when I'm tired, and also done for the day. The red dot on the monitor kept its one job steady as a small star. The decision came on a Thursday that remembered how to be bright. We rose when the bailiff called and sat when the judge did. He read without flourish voice, even each sentence set down like a plank laid true. Petition for guardianship is denied. The court finds Ms. Quinn competent to manage her affairs. Protective order to remain in effect. Counsel are admonished to refrain from further attempts to obtain signatures outside appropriate channels. Paper moved. A pen clicked.
Chairs creaked as if reminded they had jobs. Brandon stared at the middle distance the way people look at a mirror they don't like. Lila's hands found each other and held on. Ava touched the edge of the table with 2 fingers, then gathered our copies and placed mine in a folder as thin and sufficient as a well-made envelope.
Outside, the steps still held a little rain in their grooves, but the air had swung toward clean. Ava and I stood 1 pace off the doors while the courthouse breathed people in and out. She didn't hug me. She's not built for that. She lifted her chin instead, a small salute. "You're clear," she said. At Seabrook, the blue stamp on the protective order looked less like a warning and more like a note in a margin that had been answered. I pressed it flatter, set the folder in the drawer where Dan kept warranties for tools that never broke, and made tea that tasted exactly like boiled water in time. The house exhaled the way houses do when they understand their job again. In the weeks that followed, the tide kept its math. The cameras kept their small red punctuation. I walked the rooms with a pencil behind my ear and a pad in my hand, naming what would stay and what would go, and what had always only been passing through. A woman with a soft voice and a hard notebook talked comps and square footage, asked about the age of the roof, and the romance of the view told me the words buyers used when they meant light and quiet and status without having to say any of those things out loud. An architect couple came on a late morning when fog pushed in like a shoulder and made its own walls. They stood at the window and didn't perform their awe. They inspected the stairs, the joinery, the way the porch held a person up. The woman ran her hand along the rail with the respect of someone who knows what work smells like. They didn't promise to preserve anything. They promised to understand what was there before they changed it. I signed where signing made sense. At the title office, Mr. Patel stopped by with coffee and a nod. The keys came off my ring 1 by 1 until the bowl at Seabrook held them all a circle of brass like coins counted out loud. I set the bowl in the center of the empty kitchen and stood quiet long enough to memorize the sound of a house that no longer belonged to me. On Bay Street, there's a small office with a fluorescent buzz and a bulletin board crowded with phone numbers written on tear-off tabs. I wrote a check there and left it with a woman whose cardigan had pills at the elbows and whose eyes said she had weathered worse stories than mine. The receipt slipped into my wallet behind the library card and stayed there as if it had always been required. The apartment I rented faces the marina. Morning opens with gulls practicing their vowels and men talking ropes. The floor tilts the tiniest bit the way old floors confess they've lived. My furniture looks like it enjoys being less serious. I put the blue bowl by the door, set a single key in it, and watched it look perfectly at home. The quilt took the back of the chair by the window as if it had been waiting for this exact square of light. From that chair, the water is a sheet of tin some days, and broken glass on others always itself. Lila texted a week after the move. "Can we meet?" Just me. We chose a cafe that keeps its promises hot. Coffee-clean tables, windows that don't lie about the weather. She arrived early and sat with her coat still on, as if she hadn't decided whether she was staying. "I'm sorry," she said when I sat the words as plain as she could make them. I let him decide how big my voice should be. I let money talk like it paid the mortgage on who I am. She tried to smile, and the attempt itself did most of the work. "I can list every excuse like groceries, but you were the one who stood in the kitchen and made dinner out of whatever was there." I listened. She was older in her face than photos admit. When she reached for my hand, she did it without rehearsing. "I can't fix what's done," she said. "I can only not do it again." The coffee cooled.
We talked about small, safe things until they didn't feel like fences. The apartment's crooked floor, the way the fairies make their own weather, a bookstore on Oak that still gives paper receipts. When we left, she hugged me once, not tight, not brief. 2 women in coats outside a cafe letting go slow enough to count.
Back home, the apartment held itself lightly. I folded the quilt across my knees and wrote in a new notebook I hadn't decided how to misuse yet. No legal language, no exhibits, just the day gulls too loud for their size, the dockhand's laughter carrying farther than it should the satisfaction of a key that turns without argument. The marina lights came on one by one and made a private constellation out of what the map calls ordinary. I set the pen down, ran my palm over the stitched squares and listened to the room remember my breathing. The bowl by the door held its single bright shape. The window's glass kept the wind honest. Somewhere below, a line tightened and a cleat agreed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.